welcome back to my review series on novelty board games. Today, we're going to look at another adaptation of a classic Jim Henson movie, 1982's The Dark Crystal. The Dark Crystal is an absolute spectacle of a movie. Most people know it as a sort of spiritual predecessor to Jim Henson's Labyrinth, but it was more ambitious. The Dark Crystal featured no human actors, instead just relying on puppetry and practical effects. When I hear the term movie magic, this is what I think of. There's no CGI here. This is all real stuff. So if you appreciate the art of filmmaking, I would recommend it for that aspect alone. This movie is to puppetry the same way Clash of the Titans is to stop-motion animation. Story-wise, it's a fairly simple yet very creative fantasy romp. Basically, in this world, there are two clashing tribes: the evil, violent Skeksis and the good, peaceful Mystics. In the ancient past, they all used to be the same type of creature, all bound together by the magic of the titular Dark Crystal. But at some point, a shard broke off, which led to these creatures splitting apart to their respective groups. The Skeksis control the crystal, which gives them the power to rule the land. But the Mystics have the shard that broke off. An ancient prophecy states that a small creature called a Gelfling will take the shard and reconnect it to the Dark Crystal, which will bind the Skeksis and Mystics back together and bring peace once and for all. So the movie follows the Gelfling named Jen on his adventure to do just that. That's a pretty good setup for a fantasy movie, and I can see how that would be a good setup for a board game as well. Since the board game company River Horse had some success with Labyrinth in 2016, they followed it up with The Dark Crystal just a year later. But this was not the first board game adaptation of that movie. In 1982, there was not one, but two games released that were tie-ins to the movie. One was a card game, and the other was a more traditional board game. That's great! Now I can do a side-by-side review, and we can see how they approached adapting this story back in 1982 versus how they did it more recently. Let me just see if I can find a copy of that classic version online. Oh, wow. Nope, I will not be doing that. Sorry, no Patreon account for this show, so we're just going to be looking at this game. And honestly, it may be for the best. This classic version is clearly just a collector's item now, and judging by these photos, it appears rather simple, but unmistakably cheap. Look at those pieces. Total trash. Clearly not worth the $200 you might spend today. If the prices come down, I'll get to it. But since that isn't happening today, let's take a look at River Horse's production of Jim Henson's The Dark Crystal. Roll 'em! If you remember my Labyrinth review, I said that one of the strongest elements of the game was its presentation. The box art, board, and game pieces were all well produced. So basically, every compliment I had for this aspect of that game applies here to this game as well. The box art, game board, and pieces are all just stellar. River Horse set a high standard for presentation with Labyrinth, and they definitely live up to it here. Unfortunately, the weak point of Labyrinth was the actual gameplay. So let's see if they corrected course here. As I've stated, the game pieces, cards, and board are all very similar to what was included with the Labyrinth board game. So I imagine we all have the same initial question. Is this just the same game with a different setting? Not quite, but it's close.
I don't understand.
The big difference here is that this game is more of a competitive game than a collaborative one. In Labyrinth, all four players were on a team, playing against the game. Here in the Dark Crystal, each player is competing with all the others, as well as the game itself. The only exception to that are the two players who pick the Gelfling characters. Jen and Kira are on a team, but the players who pick the Skeksis are not. It is the Gelfling's goal to restore the shard to the Dark Crystal, but it is the Skeksis' goal to prevent that from happening, but also to control the Emperor token in order to win. This all makes the game significantly more complex than Labyrinth, but there are still a lot of similarities. For starters, as I mentioned prior, the presentation here is nearly identical to Labyrinth. If you've played Labyrinth before, you'll be immediately familiar with everything here. First, the game board. Like with Labyrinth, the game is played in 2 stages. Stage 1 is where the characters move in either direction around the board, landing on spaces and then dealing with challenges presented by cards that are drawn and placed there. Stage 2 is a series of combat challenges before reaching the final spot on the board.
She will destroy us!
Also, concepts like willpower tokens for hit points, the ability to rest to recover hit points, and rolling different-sided die for brawn, wit, and speed are all lifted directly from Labyrinth. So if you didn't like all the dice rolling in that game, well, it doesn't get any better here. Although there are some significant changes. Since only Jen and Kira can be on a team, you might assume those characters have an advantage, but that is not true. The Skeksis have the ability to control the Garatham, which they can send to attack you, and they can also attack you themselves. I mean, the Labyrinth game was hard enough with all 4 players trying to accomplish the same goal, but now 2 of the players are actively trying to help the game beat the other 2. All the Skeksis fight over is the Emperor's token. Their primary goal is still to defeat the Gelflings. So are the changes here all for the better? Well, that depends.
Big change! Sometimes good, sometimes bad.
It certainly presents a better challenge than Labyrinth, which means you'll have to pay closer attention and be willing to play a few times before being able to expect a win. The changes definitely make the game feel like a next-level version of Labyrinth, and I think that's good. But in other areas, I don't believe they changed enough. Character traits are still preset and unchangeable, and although the board and cards are nicely designed, they feel a little less special considering that they're just reskinned designs from the first game. And worst of all, the game still relies on endless dice rolling. Dice rolls on every move, every card, and every combat. After a while, it simply gets monotonous. I was really hoping Riverhorse was going to find a way to change that up for this game. And on top of everything else, they kept the time element in the game. Yeah, I thought the timepiece was one of the more frustrating elements of Labyrinth, so I wasn't happy to see it here as well. But I must say, the 19 turns you start with here are better than Labyrinth's 13. And the instruction manual says you're allowed to change the number of turns to 23, or even higher if you want. So I guess the clock is here, but it's also kinda not. It's really up to you. So is this a game I would recommend?
No!
Well, again, it depends. If you're looking for a simpler, more accessible, more family-friendly sort of game, I would recommend the game based on the simple, accessible, family-friendly movie, Labyrinth. So if you want a game that's a bit more challenging, more complex, more conflict-driven, it's only more appropriate to choose the game based on the movie with those attributes as well. As long as you have a high tolerance for repetitive dice rolls and a strong nostalgic connection to these movies, I think you can have a fun night in with either game. It just depends on your group. If the group is mostly casual gamers or kids, go with Labyrinth. But if the group is more competitive, more involved gamers who would want to play multiple rounds, then check out the Dark Crystal. Especially now, because unlike the 1982 games based on the Dark Crystal, prices for this game are pretty low online. Hopefully I'll have a chance to look at some more newer games next year. But for now, I've got a stack of older ones I really need to get through. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Kids completely out of control.
Look, I'm skating!
It's time to call Nanny 911. We've gathered a team of world-class nannies to help families in crisis.
Excuse me, is this Mad Magazine? My name is Bart Simpson. My father has a subscription. I'd like the Grand Tour, please.
Listen, kid, you probably think lots of crazy stuff goes on in there, but this is just a place of business.
Oh, okay.
Get me Kaputnik and Phone Bone. I want to see the drawings for the new kids on the block.
Wow. I will never wash these eyes again.